Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Our topic this hour is miracles. We revisit it once again, as we've talked about it in the past with people like Lee Strobel and Craig Keener. But this is a book which I think you are really going to appreciate, because it really focuses in on how to maybe live a supernatural life, something which we tend not to do so much in the 21st century, especially in North America. And so this is a book entitled A Simple Guide to Experience Miracles, Instruction and Inspiration for Living Supernaturally in Christ. It is about 250 pages, came out a few months ago from Zondervan. It is written by Dr. J.P. Moreland, who's been on the program with us many times in the past, a distinguished professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology, individual that has worked with Campus Crusade for Christ, now called Cru, planted a number of churches, spoken at hundreds of college campuses, written some books that we have so often talked about here on the program, an individual that just brings a great deal of scholarship to this conversation, but a lot of practical aspects of it as well. So, J.P. Moreland, welcome back to Point of View.
Well, Kerby, it's so great to be with you always, because you and I go way back to the Jesus movement, don't we?
Yes.
I worked
all the way
with
back.
Crusade,
yes.
And you were with Probe, and it's just great to see that you're still going for it and finishing well, my friend. So God bless you.
Well,
thanks for having me on.
Great to have you as well. Let me just say that we're going to be talking about miracles. We're going to talk about maybe sometimes the misconceptions people have about prayer. We're going to talk about how we can even hear the voice of God, angels, demons, and before we're done, we'll talk about the whole issue of near-death experiences. So many things to cover. This book, as I said, published by Zondervan, endorsed by Lee Strobel, Craig Keener, J. Warner Wallace, Wayne Grudem, Sam Storms, Paul Copan, Gary Habermas, Josh McDowell, and all sorts of other individuals that have been on the program. And I thought we might just start off, if we could, J.P. Moreland, with the whole question, why so many Westerners are embarrassed by miracle stories. When we had Craig Keener on, we talked about the fact that we don't see as many of those miracles in the modern world, especially in the more developed world. But I think there's a tendency for Westerners to say, I'm really not even going to talk about miracles, and if it happens, well, I'm just going to keep it to myself. Why so?
Well, I think we have lived for decades and decades and decades under the influence of a naturalistic view of the world, whether we know it or not. And in fact, even those of us in the church who believe in Jesus and God have struggled against leading a practical atheist life. And I think that is because we tend to dismiss miracles because they're quote-unquote not scientifically credible, and they tend to happen among uneducated peoples, which is not true. It does happen there. But I think that's the reason. I think maybe the other reason is that we don't really need them quite as much as people in other cultures, because we do have medicine. But nevertheless, finally, Kerby, I think we don't have eyes to see what's really going on. And we don't tell one another what we've seen and heard because we're embarrassed. We don't want to feel like people think we're crazy or that we're super spiritual or what have you. So I think we keep quiet. Do you mind if I say one more thing on that? I go into churches and I'll take a survey. How many of you have seen a specific answer to prayer that could have been a coincidence. I mean, 80 to 90%. How many of you yourself were healed miraculously, or you credibly know of someone who was healed in a miraculous way? 70%. How many of you have had God speak to you and guide you in a way that you knew wasn't just a coincidence? 80%. But you see, what happens is we're afraid to share these things, like I said, because we're embarrassed or we don't want to come across super spiritual. And I think what we need to do, and I've got a practical advice in the book about how to grow in your expectations, one way is we just need to start talking to one another about what we've seen and heard.
Let me just say, too, that I love the practical aspect of this. There are a couple times where, as people read through that, they're going to say, I'm going to need to know a little bit more about probabilities and math and logic and things like that. But you have some very practical things, 8 ways, for example, to increase our expectation of the miraculous. And I would highly recommend that, just because it will certainly cause you to want to live more supernaturally, which is, of course, the sub-theme of the book. But
Yes.
Yeah. Go ahead. But one other thing I thought I'd mention is that the focus that I think we're going to have for just a few minutes is going to be on Chapter 2, and I would encourage people taking notes to write down the letters IAP, because we're going to get to that in just a minute. But it's about miracles, what they are, and how to recognize them. Before we talk about how to recognize them, let's again get a good definition of miracles, because the fact that in 1969 the New York Mets won the World Series, well, I don't really call that a miracle. That we had that conversation with Craig Keener, but we do recognize that there are biblical miracles, right?
Oh, absolutely, yes. And I don't give a technical definition. Most of the book is really accessible, I think. But I define a miracle as some special intervention or act by God or some other supernatural being that is an exception to the ordinary laws of nature and is done for some purpose. So it's an intervention into the natural world that intervenes in the laws of nature, and it's done for a purpose. Now, I include other supernatural beings, and yeah, I don't want to get up in an argument about this. I'm willing to give that up. But all I'm trying to say is that there really are demons and angels, and they're active all the time. They're doing things in the world that would not have happened if they had not intervened. So I'm saying that that's a supernatural intervention into the world. It's not a miracle like God performs, but it is some kind of a supernatural action. So that's essentially what I mean by it.
And you do have a chapter on the nature, reality, and purposes of angels and demons, which we'll get to a little bit later. But I think that's important to recognize, because we have been so kind of beat down by this view of modernity, and by our so-called new atheist, and by Michael Shermer, who you mentioned, and a number of other individuals that are part of the skeptic society, that we're almost afraid to talk about miracles. And yet I have many times, JP, said that when we are doing apologetics, sometimes when I'm speaking to a group or whatever, obviously we're going to talk about messianic prophecy fulfilled in the life of Christ and the resurrection. Right. But I also mention miracles because, to say that these are not miracles, well, even the detractors, even the enemies of Jesus acknowledge that some kind of miraculous thing must have taken place. So we shouldn't hide that particular aspect of that. So let's take a break. And when we come back, I want to get into some detail on this idea of how to recognize them. You're going to be pulling from a number of sources, but I think it is a very good tool so that when some people say, well, was this just a coincidence or was it a miracle? I think we can develop maybe a little more spiritual and supernatural discernment, and that is one of the many values of this book, because it helps you begin to think about, well, when a miracle takes place, can I really identify it as such? And then even talk to my friends, neighbors, and coworkers about it. So we'll continue our conversation with Dr. J.P. Moreland, A Simple Guide to Experience Miracles, published by Zondervan. We have information about it on our website, and we'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Critical thinking is going to be important in this age of confused thinking and logical fallacies. Kevin Williamson talked about what he called the one-arm paper hanger argument. I've never heard this technique called that, but it's worth discussing because it shows up so often, especially in op-eds and news stories. He was critiquing a writer who said we should not consider adoption to be a viable option for abortion because I was adopted. I know the trauma it can inflict. She didn't personally experience trauma because she had a good upbringing, but she heard about the trauma from her biological mother. The argument goes something like this. I've had an experience, so that makes me an expert. I've had cancer, so here is what I think about healthcare reform. Another example is, I'm the parent of a child who died in a school shooting. Here's what I think about gun control. Now, having cancer doesn't necessarily give you any special knowledge about the policy positions and economic realities of health insurance subsidies or hospital procedures. Healthy people and sick people have a variety of opinions about healthcare. Being sick does provide an emotional appeal, but it doesn't provide more intellectual weight to the argument. And notice how this argument is often used to promote a liberal agenda. It is rare to find a headline like this: I am the parent of a child who died in a school shooting. Here is why I support the Second Amendment. Sometimes the argument is reversed. I'm a millionaire, but I believe rich guys need to pay higher taxes. This argument should be accepted because it goes against my own interest. But again, it's an emotional appeal and doesn't deserve more weight than any other arguments. We need more critical thinking in our world. That's why we should be on the lookout for one-arm paper hanger emotional arguments. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today J.P. Moreland. Again, this is his book that has been out for a couple of months, A Simple Guide to Experience Miracles, Instruction and Inspiration for Living Supernaturally in Christ. About 250 pages, very good annotated bibliography so that you can read other books that relate to some of the things we're talking about. It is available in paperback and Kindle. We have it available on our website. You may be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we've made it very easy for you to get a copy. J.P., let's, if we can, then answer this question: how to recognize miracles. I thought this was such a helpful chapter because there are times when you'll see something that sort of seems miraculous, but you're not sure. And I have said before that when we get to heaven, we're going to see that God performed a whole lot more miracles than we gave him credit for. But can you help us out? Because I suggested many people that like to take notes during our discussion to write down the letters IAP. Can you kind of explain that?
Yeah, this is such a good question, and here's why. The purpose of the book is really to draw people closer to Jesus, to give them a strengthening of their faith and a boldness to proclaim the truth in a winsome way. Now, the reason this question fits into that is if you have a specific answer to prayer, let's say, or somebody is healed and people have prayed over them, it's just so exciting and helpful. God knows I'm here. He's acting and he loves me. But then the next day you start going, but that could have been a coincidence. And pretty soon, if you dwell on that, it erodes the boost that you got from God acting, and that shouldn't happen. So how do we tell the difference between a real miracle, and let's just focus on answers to prayer, and just a happy coincidence. Well, in the world, there are certain causes that produce effects, and some of those causes are purely natural, like a flash of lightning is a cause that produces the effect of splitting a tree. And the cause there, the flash of lightning, is purely natural. But sometimes personal agents that have free will and are intelligent are causes of effects in the world. If I come in and look at the kitchen table, and my wife has used certain, I find certain silverware there and certain dishes, and the table's arranged in a certain way. That didn't happen by an earthquake or a law of nature. The cause of that was my wife intentionally setting up the table that way because we were having our Chinese neighbors over and not our Mexican friends. And so in science, this principle that I'm going to share, IAP, is not really a religious one. It's a scientific principle that applies to the spiritual life. And it's the idea that when you're studying an event or some phenomenon, if two conditions are met, then it is beyond any reasonable doubt that it was a personal act of an intelligent free agent that caused that event or the phenomenon you're studying. And the first one is that the event has to be highly improbable. And so, if I pray that God would raise the sun tomorrow and the sun comes up, God may have directly caused that, but probably he indirectly caused it by sustaining the laws of nature. That wasn't a miracle. But if it's improbable, that is one condition. But suppose you and I were playing bridge, and we had a $500 kitty on the table. Whoever won got the kitty. And on the very first deal, I'm the dealer, and I deal myself a perfect bridge hand. Now, my hand was highly improbable, but so was yours. In fact, your hand was equally as improbable as mine. But so that is an important condition, but it needs to be supplemented with a second one. And here's why. My hand raises suspicions, but yours doesn't. The second principle is that the event has to have some kind of specialness to it besides the fact that it happened. A specialness besides the fact that it happened. Now look at your hand. There's nothing special about your hand besides the fact that it happened. It was the one you got. In fact, the only way to describe it is some hand or other that Kerby happened to get. But that's not true with my hand, because there's something special about my hand that separates it from all the other hands I could have gotten. And that is according to the rules of bridge, which is independent of the deal. If anybody gets that hand, they win. And it's a combination of high improbability and the independent specialness of the event besides it happening that indicates that I cheated. This wasn't a result that was done on purpose by a rational free agent, me. Now, this principle was actually used in the state of Ohio in local state elections, and the Democrats used it to sue a Republican and won in court. What happened was they were having local state elections in about 8 districts, and there were 7 or 8 different parties on each ballot. Now, when the ballots were printed and distributed to the 8 districts, lo and behold, the Republican candidate was number 1 in all the ballots. Now, that is highly unlikely to happen. But it would be just as unlikely if the Libertarian Party or the Green Party was number 1 in all the ballots. So that it is improbable. But the second thing is what caused the judge to decide in favor of suing the Republican, and that is that we know that if whoever's listed on a ballot first tends to get more votes simply because of that fact, and the person in charge of printing the ballots was a Republican. So there was a specialness about that besides the fact that that's the way the ballots turned out. And so they judged that this was done on purpose by that Republican freely. So an intelligent agent caused that result. It wasn't random or a law of nature. In fact, just recently, Kerby, anthropologists published an article about a cave they'd been studying for a long time that was populated by Neanderthals, and they discovered that there was a formation on the cave that a lot of anthropologists thought was just erosion and normal geological processes. But they applied the intelligent agent principle, and it tipped the scales in favor of the fact that that was an artifact that was produced on purpose by the Neanderthals. And so this is a principle used in science. Now, when it comes to, let's say, a specific answer to prayer, I've prayed so many times, and I've had something highly improbable take place. But random coincidences are often improbable, and they don't mean anything. But what made me know that that was a miraculous answer to prayer and not a coincidence was not only it was very unlikely to happen, but it was exactly what I had been praying for.
Yes.
And so there was something special about that specific result, namely, it matched an independent specialness criterion. It conformed to prayer, or it was exactly what my family was needing at that moment, that indicates that it's beyond any reasonable doubt that God did this. A really big, intelligent, rational agent that's kind of way smarter than the rest of us pulled this off. And so that has been so helpful, because if you think about that and use that principle, and I encourage readers to study it, the IAP principle, it is so valuable and helpful in assessing events that happen in your own life.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll take that idea of IAP, which again is the intelligent agent principle, and begin to apply it. First of all, we'll talk about some of the misunderstandings we have about prayer and about healing and those kinds of things. Of course, J.P. Moreland himself not only documents some incredible miracles, and we've done some of this before with Lee Strobel as well as with Craig Keener, but even his own experiences are part of that, and we'll talk about some of the cases of miraculous healing and hearing God's voice. And if we have time, we'll also spend a little bit of time talking about something that he has written about in the past, but has a chapter on in terms of the veracity of near-death experiences. So if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know more about this, we have, again, the book available on our website, if that would be helpful to you. You probably should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, that is the case. We also, of course, have a link to his website, jpmoreland.com. And a previous book that we've talked about with him was the one about finding peace, finding quiet, and those kinds of things. Of course, we've talked with him in the past about scientism and secularism and many of the other books, Loving God with All Your Mind. So many great books by J.P. Moreland. And if you'd like to know more about him, we have that link on our website as well. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, we've just begun to talk about miracles, how to identify them, and then maybe some stories of those. All that coming up right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Professor J.P. Moreland. Again, he teaches at Talbot School of Theology, author of so many books, but the one we're talking about right now, A Simple Guide to Experience Miracles, Instruction and Inspiration for Living Supernaturally in Christ, published by Zondervan. You could probably find it in your local bookstore, but we have links so that you can get it either in paperback or Kindle. And J.P., I think it'd be about time to talk about miraculous answers to prayer, but you have a preceding chapter which looks at 4 kind of misunderstandings, rather unproductive misunderstandings about prayer. So we're talking about prayer for healing. You have some wonderful examples to that, but we also need to understand that sometimes we have the wrong idea about what prayer is and how God uses it and why we should pray in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so I try to break down answers to some of those questions that I hope will be helpful to people and to encourage them to pray more and more boldly. Now, look, before I go into that, I list 14 very briefly, but very helpful reasons as to why God doesn't show up and doesn't answer prayer.
Yes.
And we all know that, and we've been discouraged by it. And but there are reasons, and if you have an unanswered prayer or somebody doesn't get healed, then I think if you went to that section, you might find 2 or 3 of those really encouraging and giving you a broader perspective. Now, that said, I basically raise the question about why would you pray if God already knows what you're going to pray for? And I make the point that God's will is capable of ruling over his mind. And here's what I mean. To say that God is omniscient means that for all truths, he knows them, and for any false claims, he doesn't believe a single one of them. But God doesn't have to be thinking about or aware of everything he knows. So, example, my daughter came to me in elementary school and said, "Dad, I got to tell you, I learned about the 3 branches of government and what they do." Well, I already knew about that, but I decided to not recall that to my mind so that when she told me, I would genuinely be excited. Now, I knew it, but I refused to become aware of it. In order for me to be genuinely excited about her bringing it to my attention. Could I have brought it to my mind myself? Of course. So that means then that it could very well be that God, who knows what I'm going to pray for, but nevertheless wants us to not think in those terms, he may decide to not be aware of what we're going to ask, although at any moment he wants to, he could become aware of what he already knew without any help from me. But he may say, I'm not going to go there. I'm going to let J.P. Tell me in a fresh way what it is that he desires. And by the way, the reason God foreknows these things is because they happened. They don't happen because God foreknows them. The reason God knows that 3 days from now I'm going to pray for X is because 3 days from now I decided to pray for X instead of Y. So his foreknowledge comes after, in a sense, as a result of what the future is. The future doesn't go a certain direction because he foreknows it. And so that's my basic answer to that question. And there's one other one that I think I should address. Why would a good God not already do what's the best thing whether I pray for it or not. And why wouldn't he thwart something bad, whether I pray for it or not? Because isn't God the kind of being that is going to bring about the best result and thwart the worst result just because that's who he is? Well, I think that misunderstands why God created us in the first place. God did not create the world with human agents in it to have at the final day a world, the history of the world be one where the greatest amount of good occurred and the least amount of evil occurred. Because he also has another project that means a lot to him, and that's to form a kingdom through history where people voluntarily choose to enter that kingdom through the gospel and then continue to choose to co-labor with God by wanting to grow with him and to work together. That means then that if I'm a co-laborer, what I do actually counts. Mm-hmm. And there will be some things that God would desire to do that's good, but he might refrain from doing it because his bigger concern is us cooperating with him. Now, the way persons cooperate is through talking. And the way we cooperate with God is first and foremost through talking with him, and that's prayer. It's just a way of co-laboring with God. So he may say, I know I'm going to refrain because my more important thing is that I want Moreland to learn that he is to co-labor with me. I'm not just going to do everything that is the best thing. I want him to play a role in that, and I might refrain for a bit until he learns to cooperate. And I do that with my own kids. You know, there are things that are best for them, but if they don't ask me, I may not give them because I want to train them up to learn to be dependent people and grateful people and not just shower them with good, whether they ask for it or not. So I think that's why prayer really does change things and makes a difference.
Just very good, and gets us into the whole issue of prayer and free will and all of the rest.
Yes.
Let's, if we can, maybe, first of all, let me just say, you said something in passing, because I think one of the very helpful chapters is chapter 5, in which you go through 14 reasons why people are not heard and not healed and all the rest. And I think that's very helpful. But just as maybe people are wondering, well, do we have examples? And one of the things you've encouraged people to do if they're going to start living supernaturally in Christ is maybe, for example, as you mentioned, reading the Jesus Film Project, because you've said that when you get those emails, it's like reading Acts 29. There's only 28 chapters in Acts. And it's kind of like out of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where they said Aslan's on the move. But there's a sense in which we are living right now, and because of social media, have so many more stories of just incredible miracles taking place with the advancement of the gospel.
And they're validated. They're not just stories. They're solid. They've been verified by enough eyewitness testimony. You're right. That's why people need exposure to this. And my book has 40 very carefully vetted stories like this. And let me give you an example of an answer to prayer. Do I have time?
Sure.
There was a missionary couple that lived for 2 to 3 decades among very, very poor Hispanic-speaking people in South America. And I know the daughter and her husband of that couple in my church. I've known them for 20 years. They're just so cool and godly. Well, years ago, this missionary couple retired, and they moved to the San Diego area. And she took a job as a public school teacher, and he continued to help local Hispanic-speaking churches, and he did it free. And so they were living they didn't have any retirement, and after living in an apartment and eking by, the woman said, before I pass away, I would really like to have a home to live in. So she asked the family to start praying that they could find one, and they got a realtor. And the realtor showed them a handful of places, and one place they went to was empty because the previous owners had moved out. And so they looked around, and the wife just fell in love with it and said, "This is the house I think God wants for us. I want to buy this house." Well, the realtor said, "How much do you have to put down, and what can you afford monthly?" Well, they didn't have 10% of what they needed for a down payment, and they could pay a third of the house payment. They were so ignorant about American real estate that they had no clue. And there was not any way possible for them to get any kind of house at all.
Let me jump in real quickly because we have to take a break, and I'll leave this as a cliffhanger. We'll come back and hear that. And also, I want you to share your story of healing as well. But we need to take one of those mandatory breaks. J.P. Moreland with us. A simple guide to experience miracles. We'll hear the rest of that story and wind down the conversation today on a book that I highly recommend to you. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with J.P. Moreland as we talk about a simple guide to experiencing miracles. Matter of fact, you have a whole section on cases I have personally verified, including one of your own. But let's get back to San Diego because it's quite a story.
Oh, it is. Well, finally what happened is that this missionary couple was in this empty house and wanted to buy it but couldn't, and they were there for about 30 minutes, that's all. And around the end of that, a knock came to the door, and the agent went to the door, and there were two men standing there, and they said, "May we speak to the owner?" And the agent said, "Well, they're considering buying the house," but she knew they couldn't. So this couple went forward, and these two gentlemen said, "Listen, we're canvassing the neighborhood today, going door to door, and we wanted to ask you, that if you buy the house, we are prepared to give you $10,000 immediately, and we'll give you $10,000 a year for 30 years if you will allow us to build 2 cell phone towers in your backyard, and we'll make them look like palm trees. Well, my God, that was the down payment, and they ended up, their yearly payment was in the 9,000 something, so it overpaid. The wife has now passed away, but this is 30 years ago. The husband is still living in that house. Now, you tell me if that doesn't satisfy the design principle. So that was a specific answer to prayer. Healings. A Jewish woman came to our prayer room. She was terminally ill and committed to hospice care. She had 51 points of cancer throughout her body, and there was no hope for her. But she was Jewish, and a Christian friend said, why don't you give it a shot at this church? They pray for the sick. She came 3 Monday nights. The first 2, nothing happened, but the third Monday night, she could feel a warmth and heat pour through her body as she was prayed over. And she intuitively knew she was healed. So she called the doctor and got a special appointment. He did another scan, and he came out of after it developed with the before and after scans. And his jaw was on the floor because he says, not only do you no longer have cancer, but there's no record you ever did. And he showed her the 2 scans, and she committed her life to Jesus on the spot because of that. About 10 or 15 years later, this happened 7 years ago, I was going to speak on PBS, and I wanted to share that case, so I got in touch with this woman, and she verified everything that the people who were there when she was healed told me, and she is still following Jesus all these years later and has never had her cancer return. So in the chapter on demons, I claim there are different ways we know demons are real. One, I trust that what the Bible teaches is true because I've been around long enough to know it's reliable. Secondly, if psychiatry and therapy won't do anything for the problem, but if deliverance prayer does and they're healed, that's an indication that it was demonic and not psychological, and I know of cases like that. The third reason is that the person who is allegedly demonized can't do the things the New Testament says that demonized people can't do. They can't claim Jesus as Lord. They don't love the Word or their brethren. Well, why is that if they're just multiple personality cases? And finally, I know people who've been in deliverance meetings with 7 or 8 other people, and the demonized person went around and said secrets about each individual that no one could know. And this professor that was leading the meeting went to each one afterwards, and everything that this demonized person said was spot on and true, and there's no way the human being could know it. So demons are real, and I talk about how we deal with them and so on. May I say something regarding near-death experiences?
Please do. We got a couple minutes left.
I think that the vast majority of them are true. I think they're biblical. I think there are some that aren't, and they're made up, or they're just hallucinations of some kind. But the vast majority of them conform to biblical teaching on this, and they're beyond reasonable doubt because of the evidence for them. So that's my book. I discuss 5 kinds of miracles, answers to prayer, healings, God speaking to you under the authority of the Bible, angels and demons, and near-death experiences. And I hope that it will encourage people to believe in and to enter in more to the power of God's kingdom.
One more thing. In the last chapter, you talked about where do we go from here? Because in some respects, what you did this for was so that people would begin to live a more spiritual life, because we have, I think, so quickly imbibed and accepted kind of this modernist, secular kind of mindset. And you talk about exposure and enactment. And again, you also have an annotated bibliography. So there's some resources there so people can really begin to take the ideas in your book and live them out day to day, right?
Yes, that's right. And that's the end. That's the practical application at the end. You bet.
Just finally, before I let you go, I did also want to encourage people, if they would want to contact you. For example, we have a link to jpmoreland.com. There it gives your calendar. Of course, you have your blog, all of your different books and resources. I suspect every time you speak on this issue of miracles, people want to tell you another story. So if people would like to contact you or have you come and speak at their church, that's still available too, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So again, all of it available through jpmoreland.com. The book is entitled A Simple Guide to Experience Miracles, Instruction and Inspiration for Living Supernaturally in Christ. And so, Dr. J.P. Moreland, it is always a delight to have you on the program. Thank you for all the books that you have written and for the fact that we've been able to interview you on so many of them here on Point of View. So appreciate you being with us. And as always, look forward to the next opportunity.
It's been my privilege. All right, my privilege. Thank you.
Oh, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to get some issues in the news. I figured it's about time to really talk about some of those issues, and we will certainly do that. My action item for you today, which you will find, we've just posted it, a free resource on the whole issue of resisting the communist propaganda that's going to happen at this Winter Olympics in Beijing. We are convinced that as important, I think, as it is to support the athletes that are going to go to the Olympics, and as much as we value that, we also talk about so often here on Point of View the fact that communist China has a very long history of human rights abuses. And for us to have the Olympics in Beijing, this, I think, is going to just almost put a seal of approval on some of the actions of China. It is very reminiscent of what happened back when we had the Olympics in Berlin in the 1930s, and I think there is a real concern about that. So what we're making available, we'll let you make your own choice, is a fact sheet which I think encourages you to think about and really pray about and then act on whether or not you would want to at least boycott the Olympics. The government is not going to boycott them. The president is not. The U.S. Olympic team and committees are not, but that doesn't mean you need to watch them. So we wanted to give you a fact sheet, and so if you go to our Take Action item at pointofview.net, you'll see that it says free resource, resist communist propaganda by boycotting the 2022 Winter Olympics. And we have information about that. We have a fact sheet that you can download, and then we'll leave it to you to make your choice about whether you will watch or avoid watching those Olympics. It's a way you can send a signal, and we wanted to give you that resource so that you can take appropriate action. All available at the website at pointofview.net. If you find yourself saying, I really want to know more about this book on miracles or some of the other books that we've done interviews on miracles, you can go to the website pointofview.net. If you'd like to listen to it again, you can click on that red button that says listen or watch, and it is available to you as well. We have a lot to cover, a lot of things in the news. We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today here on Point of View, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Get back into some of the issues in the news, and then at the bottom of the hour, we're going to have Dan Martin in with us, because the Pure Hope Ministry has the new book, just came out today, The Pursuit, Reframing Purity as a Relationship, Not an Accomplishment. So I think you'll appreciate that as well. And so they're dealing with some very important issues related to sexual ethics. So let's, if we can, get into, first of all, the issue of COVID, then a little bit on non-citizen voting, because that has surfaced as an issue. A couple of the articles we've posted on the two-headed fight for Ukraine, and that may be all we have time for. I was at a political event last night, and somebody was saying, well, you must have a lot to talk about. I said, you have no idea. As a matter of fact, right now I'm just taking pieces of paper and putting them to the side, knowing I will not get to them today, and there's a lot to talk about. But let's talk about the obvious one, and that is COVID. Yesterday, are you ready for these numbers? 1,486,000 new cases of COVID. And so, again, the highest single day figure. And when you talk about those who are hospitalized, 146,000 Americans are hospitalized with COVID every day. So this is something that deserves some attention. Now, to be trying to be positive in the midst of some discouraging news, it seems less lethal. And as a matter of fact, let me jump ahead. The variant, that is the Omicron variant, seems to be sort of burning out in England and Denmark. Not here, but maybe that gives us a possibility of hope. How are we going to deal with this? Well, the CEO of Pfizer the other day simply said that the virus is probably going to be around for the next decade. And I think that's probably reasonable. The idea of this pandemic becoming endemic is, I think, pretty unlikely at the moment. And so he says, so our company's booster shots will be able to control the pandemic. We're already starting to hear about the fourth booster or the second booster shot or the fourth shot, the fifth shot. Anyway, that's where we find ourselves in that regard. We could do an entire program on COVID. You don't want to hear that, but I do want to at least address one other issue while we're talking about COVID. And that is our CDC director. A lot of people talk about it. I didn't get to it yesterday. I don't want to go one more day without mentioning this, because Dr. Rochelle Walensky, who is the director of the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, actually is, as they said in one particular column, starting to recognize that there were some costs to this pandemic and the way we dealt with it. James Friedman used, I thought it was a great line. So now she tells us this, because he says, last week he pointed out that his column said that after 2 years, $4 trillion of federal debt and millions of isolated children, now we have Dr. Anthony Fauci talking about the cost of pandemic restrictions. And now we have Dr. Rochelle Walensky, who is the head, of course, of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, talking about the fact that maybe we need to come up with a different strategy. Why so? Well, she said this the other day on ABC's Good Morning America. Now, to be fair to her, I've got another article here, and if we had more time, I'd go into it. I think ABC edited her in an inappropriate way. So, again, I know that might surprise you that there's media bias, but nevertheless, they cut her off in mid-sentence and didn't put it in context. Let me do a better job, because the question was, should we be rethinking how we're living with this virus? And again, she responds, the overwhelming number of deaths, over 75%, in other words, 3 out of every 4, occurred in people who had at least 4 morbidities. So really, these are people who were unwell to begin with, and yes, really encouraging news in the context of Omicron. Well, again, there is a line that's missing. That was the part that was posted, and it made it sound like she was actually really excited about people dying. No, if you get it in the context, she's just simply saying that we recognize that this is certainly a very deadly disease or virus to people that have comorbidities. But she was trying to get across, and I think, let's be fair to her, that for people that are healthy, we are able to maybe manage it in different ways. How different that is from let's locking down the entire economy, let's making sure that no kid gets to go to in-class and a variety of other issues. So, again, I love the line from James Freeman. So now she tells us, we suspected that for some time. We've done interviews on that in the past. That book that came out by Jay Richards and others, his co-authors, really raised that question. Other people have raised that question. Now you're finally having the CDC saying that indeed that may be the case. As I like to say more and more, common sense is breaking out all over the place. Let me come back to an issue. The other day I just mentioned in passing, but it was worth mentioning, that the city of New York is going to engage in an experiment. And the experiment is this. The new mayor of New York, and that would be Eric Adams, enacted a measure on Sunday that would allow more than 800,000 non-citizens in the city to vote in municipal elections. It will grant voting rights to any adult who's been a lawful resident in the city for more than 30 days. All you have to be there is 30 days for this. Now, a couple of weeks ago, you might remember, did a commentary in which I said, look, sometimes we've seen a few cases like this, of course, San Francisco being a notable one where you've had elections for school board, but even there, non-citizens could vote for school board, but you only had about 36 people actually register and vote. So it really wasn't a big issue, but I kept saying, if you start hearing the drum beats here, sooner or later, you're going to have more and more of a push to have non-citizens voting. And I thought it was interesting the other day because the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, who's, by the way, a Republican, and there was a back and forth, you might remember, between Donald Trump and him. But anyway, he was on television over the weekend. He was on CBS. And while he was sitting there, he said, I think that we should have a constitutional amendment, a U.S. constitutional amendment, that only American citizens vote in our elections. Well, the host, which is Margaret Brennan, said, well, only U.S. citizens currently vote anyway, but go on. Which is false. Yes, it is true that if you vote in a federal election, you have to be a U.S. citizen. Why? Well, that's kind of a constitutional issue. But I think we can now start seeing that there is getting to be more and more of this emphasis on the fact that maybe we should really allow non-citizens to vote after all. After all, most of them pay taxes. Most of them are affected by the policies. Why can't we let more of these non-citizens vote? And you know exactly where that's going. So at least 3 cheers for a few people speaking up and saying, I don't really think this idea of allowing 800,000 non-citizens to vote in New York City is a good idea. And if that's a preview of coming attractions, maybe we've got to think about whether or not we might actually want a constitutional amendment to say that the only people that can vote in elections would actually be citizens of the United States. That's an issue we will certainly be talking about later this week, but I thought I'd put it on the table for you to think about because I think it's an issue that might be promoted in the future. And I'm hoping that if nothing else, you appreciate the fact that you heard it first right here on Point of View. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Critical thinking is going to be important in this age of confused thinking and logical fallacies. Kevin Williamson talked about what he called the one-arm paper hanger argument. I've never heard this technique called that, but it's worth discussing because it shows up so often, especially in op-eds and news stories. He was critiquing a writer who said we should not consider adoption to be a viable option for abortion because I was adopted. I know the trauma it can inflict. She didn't personally experience trauma because she had a good upbringing, but she heard about the trauma from her biological mother. The argument goes something like this. I've had an experience, so that makes me an expert. I've had cancer, so here is what I think about healthcare reform. Another example is, I'm the parent of a child who died in a school shooting. Here's what I think about gun control. Now, having cancer doesn't necessarily give you any special knowledge about the policy positions and economic realities of health insurance subsidies or hospital procedures. Healthy people and sick people have a variety of opinions about healthcare. Being sick does provide an emotional appeal, but it doesn't provide more intellectual weight to the argument. And notice how this argument is often used to promote a liberal agenda. It is rare to find a headline like this: I am the parent of a child who died in a school shooting. Here is why I support the Second Amendment. Sometimes the argument is reversed. I'm a millionaire, but I believe rich guys need to pay higher taxes. This argument should be accepted because it goes against my own interest. But again, it's an emotional appeal and doesn't deserve more weight than any other arguments. We need more critical thinking in our world. That's why we should be on the lookout for one-arm paper hanger emotional arguments. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And once again, let me just mention, as a program note, at the bottom of the hour, we're going to have Dan Martin in studio. He's the co-author of this new book, The Pursuit, Reframing Purity as a Relationship, Not an Accomplishment, and it is just out, and so we wanted you to know about the book and also know more about Pure Hope, so we'll get to that in just a minute. So while we are just taking a moment and a pause, let me go to one of the articles we've posted. It's by Seth Cropsey. It came out a couple of days ago, called The Two-Headed Fight for Ukraine and Taiwan. And the argument that he makes is similar to, but a little bit different than the commentary I mentioned yesterday, in which is it possible that both Russia and China might do a calculation and feel like it's either now or never to push for their best interest. Russia thinking that having Ukraine would be a benefit to them, China wanting to, if you will, quote, reunite Taiwan with the rest of China. And so Seth Cropsey puts it this way: a crisis may be imminent in Ukraine as Vladimir Putin gathers troops on the Russian border for a possible invasion. American policymakers have also begun focusing on a potential conflict in Taiwan, one that is coming to a boil more slowly. I don't think it will happen until after the Olympics, which we'll get back to talking about in just a minute. But American statesmen ought to understand these events cannot be viewed in isolation. This is the wisdom of this article. They are connected and part of the larger political cooperation and competition for Eurasia. Although separated by geography, he says on the second page, Ukraine and Taiwan occupy similar positions in the Russian and Chinese strategic experience and historical imagination. Capturing each is essential to all other strategic objectives. Here they are. For Russia, taking Ukraine would secure its hold on the Black Sea and open other pressure points against vulnerable NATO members like Romania and Bulgaria. Get out your map. Look at that right now. You can see why he's making that statement. So first of all, there is a real benefit to Russia securing Ukraine. The excuse is used that Ukraine should not be part of NATO. And so, of course, that gives them a justification for moving in there, but it would give them certainly a port in the Black Sea. Of course, we've already seen that with Crimea. But then what about the Chinese? Well, for the Chinese Communist Party, seizing Taiwan would allow the country to break out of what's called the first island chain and conduct offensive operations against Japan, against the Philippines, and even U.S. territories in Central Pacific. So if you think like our adversaries for just a minute, and yes, I do believe that both Russia and China as countries are adversaries. We love the Russian people. We love the Chinese people. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about Vladimir Putin. We're talking about the Chinese Communist Party. These are some things where if you start thinking, why would they want to do that? That could be the case. So you might naturally think that one or the other could take place. Here's the third point that he makes in the third page. Russia and China could be actually in a strategic cooperation. That's a very dangerous situation, he says. The margin of force between potential enemies in the Western Pacific is far thinner than in Eastern Europe, given China's increasing capable military advantage. Russia wouldn't have, though, to deploy major ground or naval units to the Asia Pacific, nor its offensive with China's. But again, you can see how if you at the same time had to both address the incursion of Russia into Ukraine and, of course, the attempt for China to take over Taiwan, if those happen simultaneously or even sequentially, would the United States be able to address those issues? And I think we all know what the answer is. Probably not. Given the general attitude right now from the president, which gets us to another article we've posted here as well, who is suggesting that the biggest challenges we threat are either global warming or climate change or domestic terrorists, which would be you. You can see that he certainly is not seemingly focused very much on the issue of Ukraine or Taiwan, and that, I think, illustrates a key point. Something I didn't post, which we can, it's a relatively short point that has come out. There are all sorts of evidences coming in right now that the government of China, that is the Chinese Communist Party, has been in a massive food buying binge unlike nothing we've ever seen in human history. Again, maybe you've heard that in some other news outlet. I suspect you're hearing it right here for the first time. This particular article says that the move to store such enormous quantities of food has not only caused food prices to spike globally, have you noticed that by chance? But interestingly enough, also suggest that China may be preparing for some, as they say, dark event. What do you think that might be? Oh, I know, maybe a war with Taiwan. So again, there are some people that have been covering it. Let's give full credit to Newsmax. I think they actually have a report that's coming out talking about when the food stockpiling has begun, the panic caused with this stockpiling announcement, some of the impact that this has had on your food prices, and then the possible concern that China may be preparing for war. And they've also, in addition to stockpiling, of course, all this food, we've also mentioned that they've also been stockpiling other resources. That would be gold and steel and copper, and also what are called rare earths. Now, there are a number of rare earths that can be certainly mined in China, but a lot of the places where these rare earths are coming from is Africa. And if you've paid attention to the way in which China has extended its feel and its influence there, you can see that is the case. And so this is just one more reason why I would hope that you would think about whether or not you want to watch the Olympics from China. Let me again mention that we have a free resource. The Winter Olympics will be taking place shortly. We believe that there are certainly times in which we should obviously support our American athletes. We should appreciate their patriotism, although some of them haven't been real big on patriotism lately. You've probably noticed that as well. But there are also some times to take a stand. Some of you old enough remember that we did not send any of the American athletes to Russia. This time we're obviously sending the athletes to the Winter Olympics in 2022. But again, Communist China has had a long history of human rights abuses. If you get our page that we're making available to you, we remind you of the fact that this isn't the first time we've had to think about this. We had the 2008 Summer Olympics in China, and under that, China came under really sharp criticism for their systemic human rights violations. And how has that turned out? Well, they've pretty much turned a blind eye to it. And of course, we have on this program many times as well talked about the Uyghur Muslim population that has been taken into various internment camps, or what are called education and training camps, and the impact that has had on those individuals. We might add to that, I think it's fair to talk about at least the COVID cover-up that is taking place, and just the ongoing attempt on the part of China to even influence our foreign policy by establishing various centers on universities to promote that, and then to even threaten any particular group, whether it's the NBA or whether it's major corporations, to speak out against some of these human rights abuses in China. And so I think that is a time for us to look back on history and first of all look at the 2008 Olympics in Beijing in China, maybe go back to the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, which was used at the time by Hitler and by the Nazis to promote their ideas worldwide. And we can't change the decisions from the president or the International Olympic Committee or the U.S. athletes. But we can make a decision about whether or not we're going to watch those. And so we have a fact sheet which is available. And you can go to our website, which is pointofview.net. Go down a little bit to the middle section. It says Take Action, a free resource, resist communist propaganda by boycotting the 2022 Olympics. So all of it is available there. Let me also just in passing mention one other article I've posted, and that is Biden has met the enemy and he is us. And it kind of makes the idea that right now, if you wanted to understand the mindset of what is going on in the Oval Office, both the president and the vice president suggest that what happened a year ago, January 6th, is comparable to Pearl Harbor or to 9/11. And if you really start believing that and believe that we should actually focus all of our time and attention on, quote, domestic terrorists, of which I'm sure there's a few, and not pay attention to the things we just talked about, the two-headed fight for Ukraine and Taiwan, we might have the wrong priorities. Anyway, we've got some great material. It's available for you on the website at pointofview.net. We're going to come back and talk about a new book that you need to know about right after these messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, we're going to talk about a new book that just come out, and we are going to be talking about, of course, an organization we think very highly of, which is called Pure Hope. You might remember Noel Boucher. You might remember Dan Martin, who's in studio with me right now. We have a link to purehope.net. There's information about the book, about some of the events. They have a podcast. They have a blog. Also, a way you can connect with them, and you may want to do that. They have a journal and all sorts of other resources. But this new book, literally hot off the press, as they say, came out just today. The Pursuit, Reframing Purity as a relationship, not an accomplishment. Dan Martin in studio with me. He's the Training and Partnership Director for Pure Hope and a good friend. And thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having us, Kerby, and it's an exciting day for us at Pure Hope. It really is.
You have been part of an organization that has been there even before you joined it, and I think this is the first time, whether you go back to Jerry Kirk or Noel Boucher or some of the others, it's the first time you've actually published a book. Isn't that true?
It is, and which is pretty amazing because we have had some incredible people on staff that were perfectly capable of writing a book. And the thing about this book, and even if you read the acknowledgments, you will see that we pay homage to all of those great leaders that went before us, because so much of what they taught and so much of what they really built into us who are on staff now is in this book. And so, yes, my name's on it, Josh Livingston. He and I co-wrote it, but it is the culmination of 35 years of incredible leaders from our ministry. And so I would be remiss not to mention those men that you mentioned, Jerry Kirk, Rick Schatz, Noel Boucher. Those guys have done an incredible job.
And we've had all three of them on there. Of course, we've had you on, and also Josh Livingston, the co-author. And again, to go through this quickly, there is a section on God's design for purity, a section on God's story of sex, and then a third on God's gift of freedom. And I really appreciate the emphasis here because, to be honest, sometimes when we go and speak on college campuses, even in high schools, or even in youth groups, we talk about, all the reasons why you don't want to have sex, and that's all true. But if you can instead give people a positive vision, that's really what you're trying to do. And that first couple of chapters on God's design for purity is really what you're all about, isn't it?
It really is. And, I grew up in the age of kind of purity culture, and where well-intentioned adults in my life who were part of the church, my parents I would even include in this, were all well-intentioned. But the message they gave was that sex was something we shouldn't talk about.
Yeah.
Right? That sex was, it almost felt dirty growing up in the church. And the way purity culture kind of fed into that was this narrative that we were to save ourselves for marriage.
Right. That's how we used to communicate it.
Yeah. And as you said, it's not that that's unbiblical, but it is not a compelling story. And so what we feel like at Pure Hope is really a true understanding of what purity is. It's not about me saving myself for purity. King David told us we were born in iniquity, right? We don't stay pure. We never were pure. But when we are in a relationship with Christ, He is purifying us. He was the only pure one. So it's this idea. This is kind of an overarching statement, and it's in the subtitle of the book. But really helping the church, helping God's people see purity not as something that we accomplish or that we can lose, and not to confuse it with virginity. Purity is given to us. It is imputed to us when we follow Christ, when we're in a relationship with Him. And so even the title, Kerby, The Pursuit, is about pursuing Christ. And it is His work in me that's purifying me.
One of the things I love is that, Dan, between you and Josh, your chapter, of course, deals with purity is a relationship, but then also Josh talks about fixing your gaze. And so really it is a relationship when you talk about God's design for purity. And so it really is not just an accomplishment, to use your subtitle, it's that relationship. And once you have that relationship, all the other things kind of fall into place, don't they?
Exactly right. And, Jesus promised us that He would finish the work that He began in us. So it's not that we become pure when we are with Christ. We're seen as pure, but He is purifying us. It's that already but not yet kind of concept. Mm-hmm. But He is purifying me, and He will finish the work that He's completed in me.
You also talk about God's story of sex, and you, of course, wrote the one on proclamation. I love Josh's guard rails are good.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's important because, guardrails are necessary in every other aspect of life. Why shouldn't they also be in human sexuality?
I love this analogy. You think about a windy road, right? Yeah. And through the mountains, there are guardrails on that road. And the engineer who designed that road put those guardrails there, not because he didn't want us to enjoy that journey. He put them there because of the dangers that were on the other side, on when we got off the path, when we got on the other side of those guardrails. And when we can help people see that God has given us rules, He's given us how He wants to bless us in relationship. The covenant of marriage is what sex is reserved for. That's a guardrail, and He gives us those guardrails not to be a killjoy, but because He wants to bring us ultimate satisfaction, which is only found within the guardrails.
You also talk about the idea of becoming one, the two shall become one flesh.
Yes.
And really that whole idea as well. And it's, again, something that needs to be communicated not just in the home, but I think it can be very easily communicated from the pulpit and in Sunday school classes, because right now, as well as I do, this idea of disconnecting human sexuality from marriage is something that every young person is seeing. And if they're spending 8 hours a day in front of a screen, and that's the numbers that are being used, you're going to have to work really hard with a 45-minute sermon once in a week, or 2 hours with a youth group once a week to counteract that. But if you don't say anything about it, then the message of the world actually becomes the message in the hearts of these young people.
That's exactly right. And, Kirby, one of the things that I think the church has done a poor job of is we've really taken the definition of sex that the world has given us, and then we've come back and we've tried to put God's rules on top of what the world's definition. And that's why we really go into God's story of sex. This was His design. Sex is a beautiful, wonderful thing. It's not just cheap and play among adults as the world would define it. It is sacred and it is beautiful, and that's the thing that will be more compelling to kids. That's the thing that will be more compelling to everyone versus what the world is selling, because what the world is selling is going to leave them short.
One of the things I like about the book, and we'll get into the third section after the break, is you've got about 150 pages, very easy to read. If you do the math, there's 12 chapters, 150 pages. You can realize they're all very readable. And so it's the kind of thing that you could teach in a small group. It's the kind of thing that parents can teach to their kids. It is the kind of manual that I'd want to put in the hand of every youth pastor in the country, because you're really trying to help reframe this whole discussion about purity, aren't you?
Absolutely right. I love, one of the endorsements that we got was from Dr. Tim Kimmel.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things that he said when he was reading through some of the content, and I love this, he says, fortunately, there's a powerful solution in speaking to the flawed assumptions that we have about it. And he says, frankly, this book should now become required reading of any person, parent, or pastor that wants to set the people they love up to enjoy God's gift of sex the way it was intended to be enjoyed. It's a book that offers genuine hope. And that I could not have said it better. We would love for every pastor, every parent, everybody who subscribes to biblical truth to read this book and see what it is that God intended for this whole journey of being a sexual being and of living a life of purity that He's called us to live, what that really looks like without all of the things that we've brought into this conversation in the past. And I'll call that the baggage that we've brought through brokenness, through what the world has to say. Let's proclaim God's original story, and that's the beautiful story.
We are privileged to have in studio with us a little bit longer Dan Martin, and again, the book deals with the pursuit, and first section, God's design for purity, second section, God's story of sex. We come back from the break, we'll talk about God's gift of freedom, and again, give you some direction on maybe how you can use the book. And if you say, well, I want to start looking for the book, well, it just came out today, so if you go to the bookstore today, they may or may not have it, but we have a link to Pure purehope.net. When we come back, we'll talk about where you can get the book there, some of the events and conferences that they have. If you would like to have one of them come and speak at your group, or contact them if you'd like to follow their podcast, their blog, maybe even get the journal and some of the other resources, an organization we highly recommend, and the book just out, The Pursuit, Reframing Purity as a Relationship, Not an Accomplishment. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Always exciting when a new book comes out, and it is out today, The Pursuit, Reframing Purity as a Relationship, Not an Accomplishment. Joss Livingston and Dan Martin, and Dan is in studio with us. We've talked about God's design for purity, God's story of sex. Let's get to that third part, and then I want to focus again on the website, because there are all sorts of other resources. Yes, you have a book, which we're talking about today, but those pocket guides are so helpful, the journal, so many other resources. But the third section in the book is God's gift of freedom. You're talking about what's your story. Prayer is proximity. I love this one. Your past does not define you, because I have run into this situation. Well, I made a mistake in the past, so I guess that's it. No, you can fix those and then shine your light. So talk about that, because what you want is to have people not only get the head knowledge in these first couple of chapters, but then to actually get a heart knowledge, and maybe all the way down to shoe leather, so that we're actually going to follow and use this to actually move forward to take these ideas and apply them to our lives.
Yeah, Kerby, I would say that this third section is, it's been written from a place of my own brokenness in this area, to some degree. And that is, at an early age, I realized this whole idea of saving yourself and staying pure. I realized I wasn't very good at that at a pretty young age. And so when I think back to the messages of purity culture, I felt like I was out of the purity club. I felt like I had kind of messed up to a point that, well, I didn't stay pure.
That's it. Yeah.
And even if that, Jesus tells us in Matthew 5, even if you think about a woman lustfully, it's like, even if our thought life is off. And so for me, it's really about not being defined by what I've done, but being defined by who Jesus says I am and what he has done for me. And that, if I had to boil it down, that it would be that. But I will also say this, as we've done ministry across the country, I hear over and over, I hear stories about people, not only about poor decisions that they've made, but poor decisions that other people have made against them.
There you go. Yes.
And so what our message has been is, no matter what we have done and no matter what has been done to you, Jesus is purifying us. And you're not out of the purity club. And to use the analogy I used in our last section, that winding road with guardrails, the thing that I would say that God has for us in that road, in that journey, in that pursuit, there's a lot of on-ramps. And that is his grace, that he does. Nobody who's listening to this has done anything, even today, or in the last 10 years of your life. You've not done anything that God doesn't offer you an on-ramp back into this pursuit, back into this journey of pursuing Christ and him purifying you. And so really that's our hope in this third section, is that people will discover the freedom that they can only find through God's grace and his mercy.
And again, I love the fact that you have a section there on to confess it, to pursue intimacy with Christ, to trust the process, to seek wise counsel. You give people some real practical ideas, and then you follow that up with your chapter as well on fearfully and wonderfully made,
Yes.
Psalm 139. So there's a lot of hope in this. And then the final chapter that Josh has, Shine Your Light. So again, you have to, of course, pursue purity in your own life, but then to actually be a model for other individuals. So this is such a great book because it takes people from where they find themselves, maybe with a fair amount of shame, guilt, frustration, and helps them understand that, there's still another on-ramp, and that's a good thing.
And no matter what you have done, just as I said, no matter what you've done, no matter what's been done to you, we all can make a choice today to pursue purity. And it's not this stay pure mentality. The Bible doesn't talk about staying pure, but the Bible persuades us to pursue purity, and we can do that every day of our lives. Even if yesterday or today we mess up, I can pursue purity tomorrow.
Well, again, Dan Martin's in studio with us. We're talking about this new book, The Pursuit, Reframing Purity as a Relationship, Not an Accomplishment. But I want to, if I can, work our way through some of the material at purehope.net, because sometimes when you talk about this, people might think, well, I just get the book. But long before you had the book, you had some incredible resources. You have a Bible app, for example. You have free resources. You have these pocket guides to talking about sex. If I right now were to ask how many of you parents feel comfortable talking to your kids about sex, I'm going to see a show of hands. I'm not sure anybody would be showing hands. They'd be looking at their shoes. And so you've given us some resources, some parenting resources and other things that are available. So talk about what's there, because those have existed even before this book, and they are going to be very useful for people listening right now.
Yeah, the pocket guides really were something that we had been asked for by a number of different organizations organizations that we were partnering with. The first one we wrote was kind of our sweet spot at the time, the Pocket Guide for Parents, to help them begin to have conversations with their kids. And the way that we say it is to develop dialogue, not just to have a one-time conversation, but to have an 18-year conversation when it comes to sex, really helping them have dialogue.
Yes.
We also wrote, then the second one we wrote was a pocket guide for talking about sex for pastors and ministry leaders, so that, just as you said, that, you know, for the Sunday school teacher or the senior pastor or the men's ministry leader or the women's ministry leader, to give them some help in really creating conversations. And so the pocket guide for ministry leaders was written with that in mind, to really catalyze conversation. And then the one we just most recently wrote was for couples, for married couples. And I would even recommend it for engaged couples, because what it does is it really helps men and women, husbands and wives, overcome the barrier that so many marriages have when it comes to talking about sex openly and honestly. And it encourages husbands and wives to sit down and express what they're feeling, what they're having difficulty with, and really to work through that from a biblical perspective. So those three alone, I feel like, really cover probably anybody listening to this, and are hopefully helpful tools.
Just before we run out of time, you have a podcast, you have the blog, but you also have a place where people can connect through your newsletter, also through the journal, which I think very highly of. But most importantly, I think some people might say, well, now that you got a book, you got all these resources, can you come to my church and come and do a training? Can you do that?
Absolutely. And really, that's our team is so well equipped to do that. We do that in a number of different ways. Churches, whether it's an all-church conference or it's a parenting conference or a men's conference or women's conference, we speak at those all the time. Christian schools, we've done a number of parenting events in conjunction with Christian schools.
Yes.
And I get asked often to, hey, will you speak to our students? And I always say, yes, we will, if you allow us to also talk to the parents. We don't want to be a hired gun to have conversations with the kids. We want to be a catalyst to create conversations between parents and kids. And so we do that at Christian schools as well.
Again, purehope.net. That's your one-stop shopping. But first of all, congratulations on this book. Josh is out in North Carolina, right? You're here in the Texas area, so you have people scattered around, so you can certainly find some of those speakers then. So, Dan, I've appreciated working with you and all of the people there at Pure Hope, and just great to have you in studio today.
Kerby, you've been a great supporter of our ministry. Thank you.
We're out of time before we're out of content, but again, you can get the book, and we have information about purehope.net right there, as well as some of the other interviews and conversations we've had here today. Just about out of time, so first of all, I want to thank Andrew for his help as an engineer, Steve for his help as a producer, and if you think we are done for the week, oh no, we're just getting started. We've got some great things that we'll be talking about later in the week, so join us every day right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.